Deborah Hoyt suddenly woke up in the middle of the night. But as she was sitting there, she had this overwhelming urge to want to leave right then and there. She shook her husband awake and told him about it. She thought that maybe something was wrong. And he said, you know what, you probably just had a bad dream and you're kind of waking up still half in your dream. And so Deborah said, yeah, you're right. I'm totally overreacting. I'm sure it was just a dream. And she laid back down to try to go back to sleep. But as she laid there, that sense of dread that something was wrong and that she had to leave right now, it was just growing and growing and growing until she just jumped out of the bed. She's just standing in the room and she says to her husband, honey, we gotta go right now. I don't know what's wrong, but we gotta go right now. And so the two of them hastily packed up and then they got in their car and they drove off. After a little while, the couple reached a very dangerous section of their journey back home. It was called Ballen Bend, and it was a very windy road up in the mountains where one wrong turn and you're going flying down the side of a mountain. After driving through this area for about 15 minutes, they rounded a particularly sharp turn, and as soon as they made the turn and could look down the road, Deborah, who was in the passenger seat, she saw up ahead on the right something that was just lying there on the side of the road. And she looked at it and couldn't really discern what it was until they were right next to it. And she looked out her window and she noticed it was a woman's body, a woman who had no clothes on, who was just lying there totally motionless. And Deborah immediately turns to her husband and says, honey, I just saw a dead woman on the side of the road. And her husband immediately is kind of panicked and doesn't slow down. He just keeps driving and says, hey, should we stop? Should we turn around? I mean, maybe she's not dead. Maybe we can help her. But Deborah at this point is now terrified and she's saying, no, keep going. Don't go back. I bet it's a trap. They decide that their best course of action is just to drive on and find the next payphone and call the police. So a couple of minutes goes by, the police show up and they tell them to drive back up the road, but stop about 200 yards short of where you believe this woman's body is. And so they pulled over on the side of the road. The police came up on their side and they said, yep, right around the corner, you're going to find her lying on the ground on the left side. But after several minutes, the police came back down the road and they stopped next to Deborah's car and they said, you know what, guys, we didn't see anything up there. And so they told Deborah and her husband to just head home, and they did. The two responding officers drove back to their police station, and once they were inside, they began speculating about what Deborah might have seen. And as they were talking, another officer came into the station, a guy by the name of Rich Strasser, and he overhears them and he goes over. He's intrigued and he asks them, what happened? What did you see? And they explained to him that this woman, Deborah, had spotted a supposed dead woman's body up on Ballen Bend. And as soon as he heard Ballen Bend, Rich remembered that just a couple of days ago, they had received a missing person report of a young woman named Christine Skubish and her young son named Nick, who had gone missing, and the last place they had been seen was up on Ballen Bend. And so Rich wondered if maybe there was a body up there and maybe it was Christine's. And so the next morning, he headed out to Ballen Bend, and when he reached the exact spot where Deborah had claimed to have seen this dead woman's body, he found a children's shoe. And so he walks over to the guardrail that overlooks this very steep embankment, and he looks down the other side. But as he's looking, he thinks he sees more clothing farther down the mountain. And so he climbs over the guardrail and he very carefully maneuvers his way down, and after only a couple of seconds, he reaches a clearing in the branches and the trees, and he can see down to where the train kind of levels off, and right down there is a smashed up red four-door sedan. It was the same type of car that Christine Skubish had been driving when she went missing. And there in the driver's seat is Christine Skubish, and unfortunately she was deceased. And then on the passenger seat is her son, Nicky, and he is alive, but barely. He had gone 5 days without food or water. And doctors would say when Rich found him, he probably only had about 1, maybe 2 hours before he would have died as well. Initially, Rich believed Deborah must have seen Christine when she was driving through the mountains and saw that woman on the side of the road. After her accident, Christine must have gotten out of her car and then climbed up that embankment and then laid on the road, hoping someone would see her. And then when no one stopped for her, she went back down to her car where she ultimately died. But according to the coroner, that would have been impossible because when Christine crashed off the road, she died on impact 5 days before Deborah saw that woman on the side of the road. So either this is an extremely strange set of circumstances, or Nicky had a guardian angel. British soldier Henry Tandy found himself stationed inside of a trench in northern France. After a long day of fighting, Henry was propped up on the edge of his trench looking out towards the German line. And at some point, Henry noticed a figure way off in the distance walking towards him. Henry instinctively raised his rifle, but he didn't pull the trigger. He wanted to make sure who he was shooting was his enemy. And after a few seconds, out of the mist walks a badly wounded German soldier, so it is his enemy, but he wasn't carrying a weapon, and he didn't appear to understand he was walking directly into Henry's sights. Henry aimed his rifle right at this German man's heart, but he didn't pull the trigger, and the man just continued to walk directly towards Henry until he got about 30 meters away, at which point he stopped and looked up and realized his mistake. But instead of trying to run away, he just stood there and stared at Henry, seeming to accept the fact that he was about to die. And so with Henry's gun still up, he glanced to his left and he glanced to his right to make sure nobody was watching, none of his comrades were going to see this, and then he lowered his gun. And then Henry and this German man just stared at each other for a while until the German man just nodded his thanks, turned around, and wandered back into the mist out of sight. The man Henry had just saved was Adolf Hitler. Residents of the Cranley Gardens apartment complex in North London began complaining about their drains being clogged up. An experienced plumber named Mike went around to the side of the building and he opened up a drain cover to have a look inside. He reached his arm all the way into this pipe to feel around to see if there was anything in there that he just couldn't see. And at some point as he was reaching, when his arm was almost completely into this pipe, his hand hit a major blockage. So he grabbed a handful of this blockage and he pulled his arm back out of the pipe. He opened his hand and what he was holding looked like ground meat, but it wasn't any meat he had ever seen before. And inside of this fleshy substance looked like little bits of bone. Mike and his supervisor are looking at each other, and Mike is like, let's just continue the process and make sure each of the apartment buildings, their individual pipe is unobstructed. And when they checked these pipes, they found all of them were clear except for one, apartment number 23, whose pipe was blocked up with more of this meaty substance. And the landlord, after finding out there was meat jammed in the pipes, got really freaked out and called the police. The police showed up, they pulled this meat substance out of the pipes, and they sent it to a mortuary where a pathologist looked at it and said, this is meat. It's human meat. And in particular, the stuff that was pulled out of apartment number 23's pipes is that of a human neck. So the police go back to Cranley Gardens, they go up to apartment number 23, they knock on the door, and when the door opens, they're hit with this overwhelming stench of just rotting flesh. And standing in the doorway of this apartment, the owner of the apartment, is this guy who's in his late 30s, early 40s, who introduces himself as Dennis Nielsen. And they say, well, we found human remains in your pipes. And Dennis immediately says, oh my goodness, I can't believe that, that's horrible. But the police are not buying it, and they say, you know what, Dennis, tell us where the rest of the body is. Dennis suddenly went expressionless, emotionless, and he just turns around and he points into his bedroom and he says, it's in 2 plastic bags in my closet. And so before the police go into his apartment to go inspect these bags, they say, Dennis, are there any other bodies in your apartment that we should know about? And Dennis sighs and he looks up to the ceiling and says, yeah, there's about 15 or 16 here. So after Dennis was arrested and brought to the station, he told them his horrible story. It had all started 5 years earlier in 1978 when Dennis was 33. He was at a pub having some drinks by himself when a teenager came into the bar and attempted to buy drink, and he was denied service. And so Dennis pulled him aside and said, hey, I'd be happy to give you a drink at my apartment. It's right down the road. And the young man, whose name was Steven, was very excited about this and said, great, let's go. Once they arrived back and they were up in Dennis's apartment, the pair had lots of drinks and they were having fun and laughing. And then at some point, the pair climbed into bed together. The next morning, when Dennis got up, his new friend, Steven, was still sleeping right next to him. And he had this sudden, overwhelming sense of dread because he knew as soon as Steven woke up, he would see this as a and he would just leave. And so he looked on the ground next to the bed and he saw the necktie that Steven had been wearing was on the ground. And so he got on the ground, he grabbed the necktie, he fashioned it into a noose, and then he climbed back on the bed, got on top of Steven's chest, and he looped the tie around his neck, and then he pulled it as tight as he could. And at some point, Dennis said Steven just seemed to give up. He looked up at Dennis and knew he wasn't going to get this off and that Dennis was determined to kill him. And so Steven just allowed himself to go limp, and then he slouched over. And he would tell police as he laid there, he suddenly felt Steven was not going to leave him. He was going to stay here as long as Dennis wanted him to. After laying with him for some time, Dennis realized he had to find a way to hide Steven's body in his apartment so no one could find him. And that's when he remembered he had a loose floorboard in his apartment. And so he went over to the loose floorboard, he pulled it up, and he saw there was a space under the floors. And so he pulled a couple more boards up, and then he grabbed Steven's body and he attempted to force him down into this space. But by now, Steven's body had begun to stiffen up from rigor mortis, Specifically, his arms were outstretched like a Y over his head. And so as Dennis is trying to force him down in there, his arms were not allowing him to go down into that small space. Dennis grabbed Stephen's body and put it on the ground, and he began yanking and jerking and pulling on each of Stephen's arms until they were pinned down by his side. And he began contorting him until he was small enough that he could pack him down under his floor. And then once he was under there, he just put the boards on top and went about his daily life. And for the next couple of days, he totally forgot about Stephen, and he would remain there for the next 7 months until Dennis finally decided to dispose of him by burning him in a bonfire outside of their apartment building. And then after the body was completely incinerated and gone, Dennis remembered thinking, I can't believe I just got away with murder. And so he would do it again and again and again, killing at least 15 young men from North London, all by strangulation or by drowning or a combination of the two. And after he killed them, he would keep them stashed in his apartment for months at a time, in his closet, in his cabinets, in his bed, under the floors. And while these bodies were in his apartment, he liked to periodically take them out to spend time with them. But eventually, in 1983, he had so many bodies stashed all over his apartment that he knew he really needed to expedite getting rid of them. And so he began cutting them up and trying to force them down his drain, which eventually clogged the pipes. Dennis Nilsen confessed to killing 15 young men and attempting to kill at least 7 others, and he was sentenced to life in prison. In 2018, Dennis Nilsen would die in prison at the age of